Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for the first in our fall series of webinars hosted by Ohio Excels and the Complete to Compete Ohio Coalition. My name is Kevin Duff, and I'm the Vice President for Policy and Research at Ohio Excels. We are a statewide education advocacy organization backed by business leaders from across the state. And our objective is to bring an informed business perspective to help improve and transform Ohio's education system so that it better prepares all students to meet the demands of our evolving economy. Ohio Excels has been honored to lead the Complete to Compete Ohio Coalition over the past several years. It is a public-private coalition of more than 50 organizations from Ohio's education and workforce systems. And this includes employers, educators, and the leaders of state agencies, statewide associations, unions, philanthropies, and community organizations from all across Ohio. The coalition's mission is to raise awareness about the importance of earning the high-value credentials and post-secondary degrees that Ohioans need to earn a living wage and close Ohio's skills gap. This includes coordinating and collaborating on efforts to increase educational attainment and providing technical assistance to other attainment champions. So in our continuing efforts to move the needle on educational attainment, we thought it would be helpful to bring in some leading state and national experts to share best practices that are happening here in Ohio and then in other states. We've selected a few topics that are connected to the themes outlined in the coalition's Bridging Ohio's Workforce Gap Action Plan, which include FAFSA completion, industry credentials, and increasing secondary enrollment. I'm confident that you will find today to be worth your while, and as we continue to advance that mission that we all share, helping more Ohioans earn the high-value credentials and post-secondary degrees they need to be economically competitive. So today, our guests are Henry Mack, Senior Chancellor with the Florida Department of Education, Dr. Keith Richards, Statewide Director of Career Technical Education Quality at the Florida Department of Education, and Jane Clark, Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Data Quality Campaign, the national leader on education data policy. They are joining us today to share how they use data from a variety of sources to inform stakeholders of workforce demands and credential outcomes, while informing policymakers as they pursue innovative policy changes. We'll also hear how states are benefiting from better data connections to workforce outcomes. Henry, Keith, and Jane, thank you for joining us today. We look forward to hearing your insights. To all the participants on the call, there will be time for Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please enter any questions that you might have throughout the whole presentation today for panelists that you might have in the Zoom Q&A feature, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And finally, a recording of this webinar will be available on the Complete to Compete website in the next few days. Henry and Keith, I'll turn it over to you to get us started with an overview of your work down in Florida.
Thanks so much for having us, Kevin. Great to be with everyone, and more than excited to talk about the great work happening here in Florida. I oversee all of our public post-secondary workforce education and training programs in the state of Florida. So this includes our traditional state community colleges, although all of our state colleges here in Florida offer baccalaureate degrees, but also all of our vocational and technical centers across the state, in addition to our K-12 career and technical education programs, apprenticeships, adult ed, vocational rehabilitation, and blind services. And I mentioned the latter because of increasing realization of the fact that these populations of individuals can serve as an immediate solution to serve or to provide the kind of talent that our economy needs. In other words, while we can think very strategically about robust career pathways starting as early as the 5th and 6th grade all the way through post-secondary to meet economic demand, and in Ohio's case, to your point, Kevin, to meet and ensure that your residents are acquiring the skills that they need to close the gaps that are there locally, I would submit that the vocational rehabilitation and blind services populations, that is to say, individuals with intellectual disabilities, physical disabilities, or visual impairment, are also ripe for engagement. And I'll speak a little bit about that at a later point. About maybe 3 or 4 years ago, upon entering office here in Florida, our governor set a vision for Florida to become #1 in workforce education by 2030. And that then precipitated or resulted in a robust audit of all of our workforce programs here in Florida. And Keith can talk a little bit more about the audit. Effectively, what we were trying to do, Kevin, to your point, is to map educational supply data to economic data. And in that mapping, build out a robust campaign of engagement. And our engagement campaign is called the Get There campaign. Florida's Workforce Education Initiative, not only to sort of help us understand from a data perspective the gaps that exist, but then crosswalk that to our outreach and recruitment strategy to then thus enroll students in the kinds of programs that we need in order for Florida's economies, local economies to thrive. Keith, if you can go to the next slide, actually 2 slides on in the presentation. We joined together, by we, I mean multiple state agency partners, our Department of Labor, called the Department of Economic Opportunity, our college system, our 28 state community colleges, our workforce system, our reemployment assistance system, called CareerSource Florida, and the Department of Education and the Governor's Office. We all came together to sort of triage the solution or debate the research questions that need to be answered in order to understand how to calibrate the education system in a way to meet workforce demand. That is to say, how can we solve the very complex question of supply and demand in a localized, contextualized fashion? In other words, we didn't want to use federal data necessarily or extrapolate from federal data sets demand, nor did we want to extrapolate from federal data sets an understanding of supply. We wanted real-time data. That is to say, academic inventory, graduation, retention, and outcome data directly from our institutions at the local level, mapped then to real-time labor market information data across the state of Florida. Frankly, to do a better job of assessing where the gaps are. Also, too, we wanted to understand the skills that were in demand and how those skills that are in demand map back to the outcomes that are being taught in the courses and the programs and the certification programs or the adult ed programs across the state. And this effort culminated in a piece of legislation entitled the REACH Act. So if you would like more information on the REACH Act, all you need to do is Google 2021 REACH Act, House Bill 1507, House Bill 1507, 2021, and glean some sort of understanding of the direction that was chartered in that piece of legislation. That piece of legislation also then created an opportunity for us to build out a data analytics platform, which Keith will get into in a few seconds, called the Education Meets Opportunity Platform. Keith, if you don't mind going to the next slide. It helps us understand in real time, again, not just what gap may exist, but given some of the criteria and metrics that we have been establishing here in Florida in partnership with other state agencies, the quality and the return on investment of our programs. You'll see that the Education Meets Opportunity Platform, we call it EMOP, has 4 principal components or dashboards. A labor supply and demand dashboard using real-time labor market information, a program quality dashboard, understanding sort of, again, the efficacy of our CTE programs as early as the K-12 level or at the K-12 level, but all the way through our post-secondary system, including apprenticeships and soon to be, including vocational rehabilitation and blind services efforts and programs, as well as an ROI dashboard. Here in Florida, and I think nationwide, we're increasingly wanting to know for the state and for the student, what is the return on investment? That is to say, how likely can I say to a student that if you enter X program, you are going to earn X wage, and by earning X wage, you're going to become economically mobile by X date, even after you account for the loss of certain social service benefits, for example. And another labor market information dashboard. So the integration of this data has been a challenge, to say the least, and Keith can again talk a little bit more about the nuances about how we've undertaken this effort, given the enormous amount of data, personally identifiable information data, housed in the Department of Education, matched then with wage data at the Department of Economic Opportunity or our Department of Labor, to understand again the quality, the return on investment, and to then build out a robust understanding of gap, contextualized per region across the state of Florida. And so, Keith, I might want to turn it over to you at this point to talk about sort of the main data components and really get to Kevin's question and really framing of today's conversation about data integration here in Florida and how that might then help Ohio.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Henry. And thank you, Kevin, and the Ohio Excels team for the opportunity to join you all today, because we are really excited about the work that we're doing here in Florida. And the work that I'm going to talk about today falls under that umbrella that Henry was just describing, this legislative, this executive Office of the Governor's charge to really focus on attainment in Florida and to emphasize career and technical attainment, career and tech ed, educational attainment as the pathway for that, and taking a data-driven approach to this type of challenge for the state of Florida. And so with this Education Meets Opportunity platform that I'm going to show you folks, kind of a live look at it in just a couple minutes, what I want to emphasize is that coming towards this problem from a data-driven approach is something that Florida has definitely tried to emphasize in the recent several years, but this project in particular has been a huge undertaking for the state and the collaboration of those different state agencies, both education, workforce development agencies here in Florida. And so pulling together data from our separate agencies in this new way has been a really big challenge and success for us here in Florida to integrate these data. But importantly, we're not just throwing together data in a warehouse and letting it sit there. The intent is for Florida to be data-driven and informed when making these types of decisions about how we're addressing attainment, how we're addressing gaps in attainment, and how we're focusing our resources and our attention on areas that need focus because of labor market demand in a given region of the state of Florida or statewide. And so with those analytics, our goal and our intent is for our agency level staff members and agency level leaders to be able to make decisions based on this information. So that data utilization is the emphasis here of making folks feel comfortable and eager to access this data tool and to use this information as part of their regular and special projects work. So that decision making is really the goal here, informing that decision making. The data security and privacy is top priority, and it's been an emphasis of this project to ensure that there's secure sign-on access and protection of this data. And we've worked with a vendor team that we've had a great success with, the Perrin vendor team and their subcontractors, Credential Engine, Clarion, Ripple, and Skills Engine, each subcontractors as part of this project who've taken up a particular domain of the work. Each of these contractors are kind of best in field for their type of work. And so over the past year, we have been working on developing kind of the initial phases of this project with our procurement at the beginning of last summer, 2021, working with our state agencies to identify the types of research questions that we want answered, the types of work that we want to support with this data-driven approach, and then working in an iterative manner to improve upon and kind of hone in on these, first initial beta versions of this Education Meets Opportunity platform. So I'm going to spend just a couple minutes, because I have a couple minutes left, showing folks what the tool looks like and what we were going for here. So I believe I've resumed my screen share. Great. So the Education Meets Opportunity platform is, like I said, a tool intended for agency level staff and leaders at this point in time. Something that has a secure login process, and this is what folks will see when they type in that URL and they're brought to that home page. One of the things that we like about this is really trying to make a data tool that felt smooth, clean, and easy to approach, and can kind of frame the context of what we're going for here and what we're trying to work to solve here in Florida. And so this homepage, we hope sets a good tone for folks who log on to this tool and kind of get a sense. As Henry mentioned previously, we have 4 main dashboards: our quality dashboard, we have a real-time labor market information dashboard, we have a supply and demand dashboard, and then finally we have a return on investment dashboard. So I'm just going to take a couple of minutes to go through each of these quickly and let you all see the feel and the scope and the intent of these dashboards. So our program quality dashboard, after I've logged in and I navigate to the program quality dashboard, I would see this. This takes our annual CTE audit data and information, our main accountability metrics for career and tech ed here in Florida, and puts them in an interactive point and click data visualization tool. And so we're able to see things for our programs, all of our CTE programs across the state, in both our sectors of our district, post-secondary sector, and our Florida college system. We can look at the data aggregated or disaggregated by district or college, or we can focus on specific career clusters, programs types, and we can also filter down or slice and dice the data by different demographic characteristics as well. So we can point and click with the intent of being able to look at things in this data tool in whatever type of research or work question that I'm trying to answer at a given point in time. And so with this CTE audit data, we're looking at things like our annual enrollments, our annual completions, looking at a year-to-year retention rate, so whether students are coming back next year or they're not coming back because they're completing. We're looking at our CTE audit success rate. So this is a metric that looks at folks who don't return from one year to the next. What happens to them? Were they leaving with either a full program completion, an industry certification, or an occupation completion point? Any one of those things we consider a success of someone attaining that in our CTE sector. And also able to look at the completers' average annualized wages, and as you see across time. And so the exciting thing about this is we can drill down to look at specific programs in specific areas. We can filter and disaggregate that data in different ways, and we're hoping that this will be a way for agency level leadership and staff to be able to access data in a way that they haven't done in the past, and to make it easy. So if, for example, there's a project on looking at our accounting programs, and we want to focus on where we're seeing enrollments or how those programs are performing and which are performing better than others, or we want to look at this in specific colleges or districts, we can hone down and do that. So it's an exciting aspect to be able to see this information. Some of these additional sub dashboards that I won't have time to get into even help folks who have a little more interest in a topic drill down into some of the components that make up these given metrics, tell a little bit more of a story. Moving quickly, I'll say that we have our real-time labor market information dashboard. This is a repackaging, a scraping of job ad data from the company formerly MZ Burning Glass. And it's looking at across the state in an interactive tool, occupations at the SOC code level, and what we're seeing from job postings. And what we're seeing from job postings, not only in the terms of the number of postings we're seeing either statewide or in a given county or workforce area region, but to also be able to see what are the skills being reported by employers associated with a given occupation. So like our accountants, once again, what are we seeing employers say as relevant skills, as relevant skills required for the occupation? Also, what types of industry certifications and licenses are our employers in Florida saying in a specific region or statewide as being necessary for a given occupation. And that degree or certificate that is required, the level that employers are looking at. So this real-time job ad data lets us see from job ads what wages, skills, industry certifications, degree levels are employers asking for here in Florida in real time for specific occupations. Moving quickly, we also have a labor market supply and demand dashboard that relies on federally collected data, both through the Bureau of Labor Statistics to look at projected demand and the IPEDS to look at completers. So this supply demand dashboard lets us compare those two and take, once again, for a given region or statewide, what we're seeing in terms of supply and demand across the state, projected openings in given areas of the state as well. And so finally, recognizing the time it is, I'll move quickly into the return on investment dashboard. And this is a dashboard where we're incorporating inferential statistical analyses. So we're looking beyond simple descriptive statistics and starting to answer questions using a inferential approach. And the main research question that we're looking at here is related to CTE students in high school who make the transition into either post-secondary or not pursuing post-secondary. What do we see in the return on investment for students who were in CTE in high school who continued into CTE in the Florida college system or districts compared to those students in high school who pursued CTE in high school but chose not to enter post-secondary education? As we think about the goal of not only Florida but Ohio as well, the goal of attainment and increasing our state's attainment rate, we think of this research question as a pretty good visualization of making the case, not only to state leaders, but to parents and students of the possible return on investments for those folks who showed interest in CTE to continue on that CTE pathway, as opposed to not pursuing post-secondary education. And we can slice and dice this question in a whole bunch of different ways. And what starts to look like a spaghetti chart here, without filtering it down, we can see by college how these changes are occurring, or by career cluster how these differences, these gaps in a return on investment are occurring, or even specific to a given post-secondary CTE program that students have pursued. And like I'll mention again, these charts become valuable and useful when we want to hone in or filter down on given areas and make comparisons, among specific programs, either in a given college or across the state, to look at those gaps in return on investment. So that's a summary of where we're at with our Education Meets Opportunity platform. We've been able to share access with a lot of the state agency users in kind of this testing phase right now. And we're getting to the point where we're building secure API sign-ons for our partner state agencies so that we can share access to it with a larger group as well.
Well, thank you both for that overview of the great work that's going on in Florida. Those dashboards are actually really impressive. So I'm going to turn the floor over now to Jane Clark, Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Data Quality Campaign, and she'll be providing us some insights into Ohio and then some other states from her national perspective. Just as a reminder, if you do have questions for any of the presenters, feel free to add them to the Q&A feature that's going to be at the bottom of your screen. We've already gotten a few of them, and so just keep them coming. So Jane, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks. And let me take just a moment here to share my screen. All right. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Data Quality Campaign, we are a national nonprofit organization that works to change the role of data so that it better serves all individuals navigating the education to workforce pipeline. And in that capacity, we work closely with state-based and national partners on the policies and practices that support an ecosystem that enables better use of data, including better data access. And in our role as advocates, a lot of what we try and do is set a vision for what things, could look like in a future state. And we're really maximizing the ability to use data. So I'm really pleased to join you today to share some kind of step back and share some broad thoughts about what better data access could look like in Ohio and elsewhere. Share some more examples of states that are providing access to data in really interesting ways, and also talk about some of the enabling conditions that we see across states that do this well. And it's really nice to be able to follow Florida's great presentation, because I think a lot of the things that they just talked through really illustrate well some of the points that I am going to make. So when I have these conversations, I always like to start with DQC's infographic about Grace. And Grace is a student who wants to enter the medical field. And if she has the right data at the right time, the right integrated data that's pulling together information about credential pathways, about post-secondary pathways and other pathways, with this information available to her, she can feel empowered to make just the best decision for herself about her career choices. And I know when we talk about data, a lot of times it gets easy to get caught up in conversations about data platforms and MOUs and IT solutions and other important technical considerations. But as I think we all know, in the education and workforce sectors, it's really helpful to stay grounded in the fact that conversations about data are ultimately conversations about people. And one of my favorite data stories that I've heard in the last year illustrates this really well. And it's from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I heard it at an event hosted by one of our national partners, Results for America. And some of you may be familiar with the work they're doing in Tulsa. They're using data in a lot of really innovative ways. The mayor who was speaking at the event described how their city was using data to address a number of emerging issues. And one of the examples that they were proudest of was work they did with in partnership with an organization called Welcoming America. And Tulsa leaders learned that they had a tremendously skilled and talented immigrant population. They were highly educated and trained and had very valuable job skills from their home country. However, their qualifications and certifications were not being recognized in the US. So Tulsa officials matched their immigrant population using the data they had, matched their immigrant populations with professionals who could work with them to certify them in their field of expertise. And as a result of that work, they expect it will increase those individuals' purchasing power and economic mobility by millions of dollars over the long run. And I really like this example because I think that it illustrates that when data is approached as a tool that can inform the most important decisions of people's lives, it becomes clear that it's not just a nice to have, but it's actually a critical resource that can literally be used to change people's lives for the better. So to have that kind of easy to use information that I describe, it's critical to build access points to integrated data that are tailored to the needs of the user. And thinking about how systems can facilitate access is a critical next step for states' education and workforce data. And as our hashtag here suggests, we really need to democratize our access to the data. So as I mentioned at the top of my presentation, and I've been reiterating throughout, we are currently very focused on this idea of access to integrated data. And this is because we're hearing repeatedly from the field that they want more access to data, and in particular, access to data about people's transition points. And by that, I mean people moving from high school to whatever comes next, or people moving from pre-K into the K-12 space. So those points where you have to get data out of silos in order to be able to actually answer meaningful questions. DQC does representative polls every year, and these polls are really valuable because they give us a sense of the national sentiment about data. And in the last couple of years of polling, this issue of access has really popped. So for example, 98% of superintendents that we polled report that they would be more confident in their abilities to make decisions for their district with better data access. Similarly, 93% of parents said that easier access to information would help them feel more confident about their ability to support their child's post-high school decision-making. We also found that despite this overwhelming desire for access, students in particular are not getting the information they need, and fewer than half said that they received the most fundamental information that they need to understand if they're meeting basic standards for success in high school, and let alone to make decisions about their futures. The nonprofit Credential engine, which I know probably everyone on this call is very familiar with, estimates that the US annual expenditure on education and training is close to $2 trillion. And we estimate that federal investments in state data systems across the years is somewhere north of $800 million. And of course, state investments in their own systems total much, much more. I don't want to diminish how much of a success it is that these kind of investments have been made in the first place. And as a result of these investments, most states have pretty robust data systems that collect and store a lot of information and can be used for a variety of purposes. But I also think that at those kinds of price tags, we should all feel some kind of urgency to fix this Ferrari in the garage situation that exists in many states where they have this incredibly valuable resource that most of the time is locked up. And in most places, we can say very little about whether this investment is paying off, since in many places they're not nearly as far along as Florida when it comes to integrating data to create the kinds of dashboards that they can do to answer these questions. So I want to turn briefly to what we mean when we are talking about better data access to set up some of the state examples I want to share in a moment. And I want to start with what access isn't. I have not named any states here, but these are all things that we have heard directly from states when we ask them about providing access to data. So data access is not having to drive hundreds of miles to a data center to be able to use the data. It's also not waiting as much as a year to have a data request fulfilled or paying thousands of dollars for a data set. It's also not data that is not useful because it's static or does not have enough granularity to answer questions. In contrast, this is our vision at a very high level for what data access should look like. And that is that specific individuals should be able to access a secure portal with their own data to make decisions about personal choices that affect them. The public should be able to access publicly available data websites that have aggregate information that is easy to find, use, and understand, and that can be sliced and diced in a way that's personalized to the questions that they need to answer. And state and local leaders should be able to access information that is sufficiently nimble and nuanced to enable them to better serve the public, target resources effectively, understand the impact of their policy decisions, and do that kind of forecasting that our colleagues in Florida just described. In each of these cases, when we talk about access, we also mean that the access point needs to be designed with the user in mind and tailored to their needs, have appropriate privacy and security safeguards, and of course, be accompanied by the capacity and support needed to do something with it. So this is definitely an ambitious long-term vision. This is work that's really hard to do, but there are states that are right now moving this direction. We of course just heard from Florida, and I want to highlight a few more. I want to share 4 examples that illustrate the different type of access I describe and that we've learned about recently from conversations with leaders in these states. And I'm only going to touch on these pretty briefly at a high level. So once I wrap up here, I'll drop links to these websites in the chat feature so people can explore them further. So in Colorado, they have created a website called My Colorado Journey, which enables the user to log into a secure portal with their personal information and use it for purposes of education and career planning. It's designed to be easy to use. It's customized to what they need and actually suggests specific actions to the individual based on their stage of life as it pulls the data together within that system. In Minnesota, they have built a public attainment dashboard that displays the state's high priority post-secondary outcomes indicators in a manner that allows them to be explored and sliced and diced in a number of different ways. They include a lot of helpful context that helps the user understand what they're supposed to learn from the information and why it matters. And it's a nice public facing complement to some really interesting work that they're also doing behind the scenes to do auto-admit programs in the state where they're auto-admitting eligible students from school districts into the state's public universities if they meet all of the qualifications for those, as a strategy to see if they can move those public attainment post-secondary attainment indicators in the direction that they want. People may be familiar with TERRA in Tennessee, the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, and it's been around for a number of years. It's a research practice partnership between the state and the research center at Vanderbilt. And TERRA is a particularly interesting and valuable research partnership because they use their resources to increase the capacity of the state to use its own data by working closely with state leaders to identify policy priorities and providing them with information that answers those questions. In turn, the state makes it easy for TERRA to access the data in order to facilitate that type of analysis. And then finally, many of you are probably familiar with the Coleridge Initiative since Ohio has some partnerships through them. Coleridge is another good example of how, when given access to state data, a third-party entity can create the capacity to address real needs that might be hard for the state to do alone. In particular, things like cross-state data sharing to get a more robust picture of education and employment outcomes. So each state has its own story. Each of those states that I just talked about has its own story about how they aligned resources and support for these projects, but DQC has found some enabling conditions that tend to appear in states that are successful. So to touch on just a few of the bullets on this slide, states that prioritize data typically have developed these resources to support a shared vision developed collaboratively by senior leaders. So for example, when Colorado was developing their state strategic plan, they agreed to start with blue sky conversations and set aside all the what ifs and all the reasons why not, and just stay focused on big picture goals about what they wanted to accomplish in their state. And once they agreed on what they really wanted to do, they started talking about what it would look like to achieve those goals. And it became clear that the strategy needed to include better access to data. Another critical enabling condition is effective data governance that is used as a cross-agency decision-making structure. California passed legislation to create a governing body for their state longitudinal data system. It not only has a representation from all contributing agencies, but also includes researchers, advocates, and members of the general public. And part of the charge of the group was to determine access priorities that the system must serve. And as one of their initial priorities, they settled on some, similar to other states, some college and career planning tools that will enable students to automate a lot of the process of applying for college and understanding the financial aid and other resources that are available to them. They did all of this in a way that complies with all applicable federal and state privacy laws, which in California are quite robust. The third enabling condition that I want to highlight here is ongoing investment to ensure that the system is sustainable, both in terms of keeping technology updated as needed and also keeping it staffed with people who have the right skill sets. Ideally, states will include a line item in their budget for their data infrastructure, but there are many other creative approaches to funding data systems. Tennessee earmarked $11 million for their enterprise data system from federal COVID relief funds, and they made the case for it in part by talking about it in terms of a specific use case that they needed to address. And in their case, it was tackling the opioid crisis in the state. So I have some recommendations here that I'm not going to go through in detail because they reflect points that I already made on the previous slide. In general, the point here is that having a robust data ecosystem with all the enabling conditions creates the opportunity to define the kind of access that is important in your state. And in addition to what government actors can do, there's an important role for the state advocacy community and its constituents. The more people are talking about and asking for access, and especially being clear about what access looks like, the more momentum there will be for this to be a priority. Advocates can often soften the ground among their constituencies, provide cover for leaders who are making the brave choice to be truly transparent with the data, and also offer advisory support to inform priorities. Texas is an example of a state that has advanced a number of data priorities through close collaboration between advocates and state officials. At the city level, Baltimore has also done some really interesting work through Baltimore's Promise, where the advocacy organization has actually taken on a lot of the work that the local leaders did not have the capacity to do themselves, but to get MOUs in place and other things to create a really valuable integrated data system that they'll be using to support Baltimore's youth and put them on a pathway to success. So I want to wrap up with another DQC infographic. We like our infographics at DQC because they're often an effective and bite-sized way to introduce an idea. And this one in particular, which is about credential transparency, taps into the experience of people who are trying to navigate a complex education and workforce landscape. So right now, in many places, there's a lot of confusion, uncertainty, and frustration because of a lack of clear information about pathways. The ideal is this future state in which better access will help states get to this vision on the right side of the infographic here, where people feel much more empowered to make the best decision for themselves and their families. Great, so I am going to stop there for now, have some contact information here, and we'll turn it back over to Kevin.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you to everyone. And also thank you to everybody putting questions into the Q&A feature. We actually do have a good number of questions. It is never too late. So if you do have a question, feel free to throw that in there. We're going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes or so doing Q&A with our presenters. And so I'm going to start with a question for our Florida friends. And Henry also typed out a little bit of an answer for this one, but I think I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. But can you speak to how you got all of the partners on board? How did you get that buy-in? And then who was the lead from the state?
Yeah, it's a really great question, since we're not just talking about building fancy dashboards to inform agency or even legislative decisions or resource allocation decisions. But really, to Jane's point, ultimately it's to inform student choice. But within this whole complex sort of effort, we are engaged in change management and transformation of behavior at the state agency level. And that kind of behavioral transformation and buy-in from other partners that are essential in the effort does not come overnight, nor does it come necessarily just by mere fact that it's now law in Florida. That helps. So when one passes a law, one must do it. And certainly when one receives a directive from the boss himself, we do it. And that is essential. However, for real change, for real cultural transformation to occur, there has to be buy-in above the law. And that can only happen if one has the relationships in place. And by relationships, I mean very often personal, friendly relationships that I would say, Keith, not speaking for you, but many of our partners and stakeholders at other state agencies, I would call friends. And it would not happen if we could not say to ourselves that, yeah, I know XYZ over there and we have a great relationship. Let's talk about how to make some of this stuff happen. And then the last thing I'll add is it's very important, I think, to indicate to partner agencies or sister agencies, such as Children and Family Services, with whom we've had to execute a data share agreement on, to integrate DCF, SNAP, and TANF data to build out a more robust ROI dashboard to inform choice. That data is not easy to get a hold of. So making the case that what we're doing is actually beneficial for the administration of other federal programs that might not necessarily be housed in your own agency, making that case for other agencies practically wins the day at the end. It also matters for the lawyers too, who are probably the biggest pains in the butts in this equation. Keith, you can certainly attest to that. All due respect to the attorneys on the call. They just, I mean, honestly, they're just trying to keep us out of jail. So I appreciate, their function. However, justifying the use of the data in the way that we needed to, rightfully so, had to receive very, very detailed attention.
Keith, anything you would add to that?
The one thing I want to add and emphasize is that, having those, relationships and connections with folks, across the street in the other offices really makes it possible to have the dialogues and to be able to show folks, progress, and to be able to solicit folks' input. And as Henry said, to make sure that it's not just in service, this tool, this data tool isn't just in service of the people who are creating it, but having that line of communication to better understand, how can we be building this in a direction that is equally beneficial to the Department of Economic Opportunity and the Department of Education. And, having the ability to, pick up the call and talk through ideas and problems really makes it a collaborative, opportunity, which has been a large part of our success with this.
Great, thank you. So we got another question about kind of following up on one of your comments, Henry, because you mentioned individuals with intellectual disabilities. They're curious about. Can you talk a little bit more about what your thinking is on that front?
Yeah, I guess at the broad policy level, certainly our most vulnerable populations are no less worthy of accessing a quality credential that can get them a job and the dignity that that job affords them. And historically, we have had a difficult time here in Florida in converting those clients attended to by the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation and Blind Services into a post-secondary credential that then is mapped to an occupation that can reasonably get someone a wage that is good. There's this whole conversation about competitive integrated employment for those with disabilities. That is to say, to not offer sub-minimum wage to those that have disabilities, visually or otherwise. And Governor DeSantis has been a champion for these populations and getting them competitive integrated education and training to then get them competitive employment. Now that crosswalking and that mapping is again a complex proposition and requires the Department of Labor, the personally identifiable information of the client, him or herself, and then also to the kind of quality metrics that Keith went through of our workforce programs to then understand which workforce program would then be most appropriate for those with disabilities to get them then that job, knowing that that job data is now localized to where that individual is, for them to become, mobile in the way that we want them to become. And so broadly speaking, that kind of robust integration is necessary for the ultimate policy aim of economic and social mobility for these populations. And as a WIOA core partner, many of you know the WIOA Unified State Plan sort of compels us to think in this manner. And so in terms of funding and sustainability and buy-in, I mean, the WIOA law itself is a great mechanism for addressing the first question, incidentally too, buy-in.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So we have one question, which I think actually would be good for all three of you, which is what a lot of the data systems that we're talking about right now are really doing a great job of tracking CTE students and their specific outcomes. But what sort of tracking is out there? I'll start with Jane, kind of generally on post-high school outcomes for non-CTE students, and how common is that effort?
Yeah, sure. Actually, well, I'm curious what my colleagues in Florida say, but my guess would be that probably the ability to just understand the pathways of non-CTE students is maybe a little bit more common, because it's actually been tricky. CTE students, that data that's collected under the Perkins Act often lives in other data systems. And so it's a lot of work to integrate it with the data systems that have information on other populations of students that states may have prioritized. That said, I think all states prioritize slightly different things. Some of the examples that I mentioned in my slides. So for example, Minnesota is doing a lot of work to look at post-secondary pathways for students going directly into post-secondary education. I believe here in Ohio, people are trying to understand pathways for students going into the military and doing some interesting work in that space. I think for a lot of states, one of the trickiest things is understanding students that leave high school and go directly into the workforce, those connections between the K-12 sector and understanding, whether they're getting quality jobs as they leave high school, or at least jobs that can lead to a quality career. It's pretty hard to do. And so it all sort of depends on what states have chosen to prioritize. But I think in most places, people are doing something to try and understand those pathways.
Keith, I'll defer to you.
Yeah, so here in Florida, I'll say that we're very proud of our longitudinal data system that we have in place, and we call it the EDW, the Education Data Warehouse. And so it's something that we've established several years ago that allows us to connect the educational pathway in the EDW, starting from PK, through public high school, and then into post-secondary, whether that post-secondary is our Florida college system, formerly referred to as community colleges, our district technical college system, or our state university system. And so with that infrastructure in place, we run a lot of descriptive reports and standard reports that feed into various aspects of the Department of Education's accountability, our long-range performance plans, and then also reports that we publish publicly on our website that are sometimes used by our program staff or used by the local districts or colleges to access. And so that's been a structure that we've had in place, and also through a three-way data sharing agreement between the Department of Revenue, the Department of Economic Opportunity, and the Department of Education. We can also track those same individuals in and out of the paid workforce as well. And so using, linking to wage records is a way that we can look at high school students and determine whether they're, going into the paid workforce or going into post-secondary, and what those outcomes are in terms of quarterly earnings and things like that. And so that's been longstanding, kind of a practice of Florida. But with this re-energized emphasis on CTE and thinking about CTE as a pathway, an alternative pathway, but not a less than pathway for students here in Florida, that's where our focus has been, to be able to take a lot of that information and then put it in this interactive dashboard. So kind of two different lines of work that are going on here in Florida, with one of a data infrastructure and the other of this, kind of pushing the needle forward, leveraging those data systems. Henry
I'll
was
just also add quick. Oh, I'm sorry, Keith. The organization SHIO has a useful tool that shares information about what states can link in order to understand pathways and how many can connect. And I'll drop that link again in the chat. I think someone will have to share it for me since I can't send it to everyone. But for people who are curious about how many states can do these broader connections that enable that ability to understand pathways, that might be a helpful resource.
I would love to hear from those on the call, or Kevin, anyone in Ohio, or Jane for that matter, about the effort that is underway nationally to link zip codes, academic program codes, to actual occupational data. So not at the broad NACE career cluster level, but understanding graduate wage attainment within the occupation that would be related to the training program or pathway that they've entered into, right? Many of you might know that there is an effort underway, thanks to the United States Chamber of Commerce Foundation, something called JEDX, refers to, Keith, Jobs and Employment Data Exchange Project.
I have too many acronyms. I'm sorry, I can't, but that is, the JEDX initiative to think about states enhancing what is collected on wage records, and in large part supporting our effort to better understand what happens to students when they enter the workforce. And so I think, Henry, your question is, what do folks on this call, what are their perspectives on that, or any interest or?
But curiously though, too, for Ohio, I'm interested here in Florida, we need legislative action in order to collect these additional elements on the UI wage reemployment assistance documentation or records, to then map what I've said back to the academic program. And so that, at least in our view, has sort of been the holy grail yet to be acquired in terms of pathway post-secondary mapping, economic outcomes, and really getting a robust understanding of the quality of our programs and the efficacy of our efforts here. And so thankfully, we're part of the JetX effort at the federal level, and we've been working with Perrin, the Gates Foundation, and the Cicero Institute to explore policy changes or language changes here in Florida that might do that. To what extent it's good, to what extent it's bad, what are the barriers? We're at the very early age or stages of this effort, and I'm kind of curious to see what generally Jane, maybe you or Kevin think, or those on the call think about this.
So I'll say from my perspective, I'm actually interested in learning more about that. So I'm going to follow up on that later. I can't speak to it right now for Ohio, but Jane, are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with it, but I would say that we're in this state of also feeling like it's the holy grail of the next step of systems, and are also just eager to hear from other states about if they're figuring it out and doing it. I do know, I'm pretty sure Washington State has a pilot program, and they're starting to incorporate some of the SOP codes into their system in order to get that specificity. But yeah, beyond being aware of the initiative, and from our perspective, hoping that states go in this direction. I mean, we, right now, and talking to states, of course, like, maybe Exxon is a major employer in the state, but right now you don't know if it's, the CEO of Exxon or someone working on an oil rig, right? And so there's a vast difference in employment outcomes between those two things. And so I think that really illustrates for us why it's so important to take that next step.
Okay. Thank you, Jane, and thank you all for your presentations today. As I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, this is actually going to be just the first of our monthly fall series. And so the next webinar is going to be on October 27th at 11:30 a.m. and focus on strategies for increasing FAFSA completion from leading states and Ohio communities. You can sign up for that and all future webinars on our Complete to Compete Ohio website, where you signed up for this one. And we'll also be posting a recording of this webinar on that site later this week. And so thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you again to Jane, to Keith, and to Henry for sharing your knowledge with us today. And to everyone else, have a great week.
Thanks, Kevin.